All right, good evening. Welcome to class 3 of Meditation 101. We meet one more time next week to finish out the course. These classes in this course have been recorded and they're available on our YouTube page, which is accessible on our homepage, tnlsf.org, at the top left, where it says, go to our YouTube channel. After that, after next week's class, in April, we begin a 5-week course on Buddhism in a nutshell, which is a broad overview of Buddhist philosophy. If that's of interest, that begins the week after next. So let me, before we introduce new material, are there any questions from prior material?
No, I think I'm okay.
All right, so on the agenda for this evening, we will begin by talking more about some things that have already come up, the different types or divisions of meditation. And then we'll move on to discuss obstacles that arise in our meditation practice. And we'll talk about some suggestions for what to do when those very normal obstacles that the Buddha observed in his own mind when he was training, and in the minds of everyone who's ever tried to meditate over the past 2,600 years. These are very common things that happen. And so there's a lot of wisdom that has also arisen about what is skillful in dealing with these obstacles that arise to meditation. That's primarily the agenda. We'll see if we get through all of that. So, when we talk about types of meditation, the basic working definition that we've already used for meditation is familiarizing the mind with a virtuous object. So, we know that meditation is not simply just trying to avoid thinking. We always give the mind an object. Some objects, an object that we're trying to become more familiar with. Some objects are kind of virtuous by their nature. And by virtuous, I mean constructive. Um, I mean a state, a becoming familiar with a state of mind that when oneself is absorbed in that state of mind, oneself experiences a state of greater ease, greater contentment, greater peace of mind. And when one is absorbed in that state, one's actions are, generally speaking, more easily beneficial for those around us when the mind is experiencing deep love, deep generosity, patience, ethics, loving kindness, compassion. It's quite difficult to when that is the actual subjective state or felt experience in that moment, very difficult to scream at someone in hatred. You can end that state of compassion and then relatively quickly move into a state of agitation and so on. But if it's true that deep loving kindness, deep compassion, etc., is actually truly present in the mind, if that is the felt subjective experience, then one really is prevented from engaging in actions that are truly harmful to others as long as that state, as long as you're abiding in that state. So those are the two ways of distinguishing. Does it generate in my own mind a sense of greater ease, peace, contentment? And does it positively influence my actions such that my actions are beneficial rather than harmful? And then the converse is also true. If a state of mind is arising that is non-virtuous or not constructive, then is my own peace of mind disturbed? Is my own mind agitated? Do I internally experience discontent? And at the same time, the actions of my body, my speech, my mind, are they more likely to be actions that are going to cause harm for people around me? Those are the times when we say things that, wound others, when we steal, when we lie, when we do things that cause harm. So, the fundamental purpose of meditation is to increase our familiarity with constructive states. And we do that. So, as I say, some states, some objects of meditation are on their face more easily understood as virtuous or constructive objects, like loving kindness, compassion, generosity, patience, ethical restraint, and so on. Some objects become virtuous due to the power of a person's motivation. For example, if we were to do an entire breathing meditation, or if we were to take the body as the object of our meditation, bodily sensations, or we were to take the mind, what arises in the mind, as the object, those objects are not on their face virtuous objects. But if the goal is to learn more about how the mind works, what is the nature of my mind, what is the functioning of my mind, and I want to do that in order to make progress on my spiritual path, then it becomes. So there are no objects that are not virtuous, either on their face, by their nature, because when we concentrate the mind on loving kindness, on compassion, etc., then naturally we become more familiar, or these other objects that we might use, the reason that we would use them, the purpose of engaging in that kind of meditation would be in some other way to further our spiritual goals, our spiritual aspirations, and those goals and aspirations are virtuous by their nature. So what this then leads to are two divisions of objects of meditation. And we've talked about these to some degree already. The first are analytical objects of meditation, and then the second are stabilizing objects of meditation. So an analytical meditation, we've introduced this previously, but it is following a chain of reasoning, a chain of logic, a chain of argumentation that is intended to lead the meditator to an insight, to a conclusion about a topic. And so I've listed a couple constructive states of mind in this class. So we could think about compassion, for example, as a constructive state of mind. So one analytical meditation on compassion would be, if the goal of including meditations on compassion in our own spiritual journey is to be able to, over time, relate to others from a place of genuine compassion. In Buddhism, the definition of compassion is the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. So, if our goal is to feel that way, is to genuinely be able to wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering, then as we're training in that, what we might do is to bring to mind a person that we care deeply for in our lives, a good friend, a family member, and to think about in their life, what are the obstacles that are arising for them? What are the painful inner and outer experiences that they're having to deal with? And how does that cause them to experience suffering? Um, and we do that in order to feel that genuine sense of, I wish they were free from this. Because that felt sense, that way of relating to them, is what we're trying to generalize through training. So we would start in this process of generalizing that. It's skillful to start with a person that you have a close relationship with, because naturally you do wish that they be free of whatever difficulties they do experience, because you know them, you care about them, you're invested in their life already. So then, in imagining, well, they deal with depression, sometimes they deal with anxiety, they have these fears, they have these physical challenges, they worry about these things. And these are all, things that weigh on them, things that they're having to, go through, stresses, anxieties, difficulties. And then when you really vividly imagine that this is happening in their life, spontaneously, the wish to remove that from their experience would arise. So then what you would do is you would try to hold that experience. You would try to focus on, what does it feel like in my body, in my mind, when I am absorbed in wishing for them to be free of these difficult situations. And that subjective state is the point, is the goal of the meditation. However, the goal isn't simply to feel that way about a person that you already feel that way about. The goal is to expand the number of sentient beings that you feel that way about. So in your meditation, then you would use that as the entryway into having a clear recognition. This is what it feels like. These are the thoughts that I have. This is what it feels like in my body, in my mind, when I'm experiencing this state. Then, once you have that knowledge, that wisdom, that insight, you would let go of thinking about this one person that you know already, and you'd bring to mind someone that you don't know, someone that you saw in the grocery store earlier in the day, who didn't say or do anything to cause you to have an emotional reaction, some just total stranger. And you would recognize that that person is someone who experiences difficulties that are quite similar to your dear friend. They also worry about their finances. They also, have anxieties, and they also sometimes feel depressed. They also, have problems in their body. They worry about their death. They worry about their loved ones. They worry about their children, etc. Um, and so you would recognize that they are a full person in and of themselves, because oftentimes the strangers that we come across, they just sort of exist in the background of our lives. We don't really contemplate that they are someone's child, that someone is their child, that they are someone's husband or wife, that they are that they worry, that they have all of the same deep emotional states that I have, that my loved ones have. We know it, but we don't think about it a lot. So you would recognize, well, this person suffers in very similar ways to my loved one. And you would imagine them being in front of you, experiencing these challenges. And the goal, even if you simply try to remember, okay, just a minute ago when I was thinking about my loved one, this was what arose in my body. This is what arose in my mind. These are the thoughts that I had. Even if I just use a remembering consciousness, can I kind of extend or relate to this more neutral person from that same place in my mind? And it may be sort of forced, it may be sort of, um, not genuinely, truly, spontaneously felt. But again, that's the purpose of meditation, is to train the mind in that direction. So even if you're just trying to use a remembering consciousness and you're sort of trying to fake it, you sort of do your best to approximate that toward this neutral person. And then if you want to be more ambitious, you would bring to mind someone in your life, someone you do know, and someone that agitates you, someone who annoys you, someone who bothers you. You don't start with the people that you have real animosity toward, um, because this is a gradual training in compassion. But you would imagine that still this person, because they annoy you in some ways, you find it even a little bit more challenging to really recognize their fullness, their humanity, all of their wants, their needs, their desires, their fears, their sufferings, because you don't really want to think about them. Even, strangers you don't really think about, but people that you find annoying, you actively avoid thinking about. So you try in your meditation to imagine, well, this is just an ordinary sentient being like me, like my loved one, like this neutral person. So obviously, they too very often experience painful conditions that are ripening in their lives again and again. So again, you try to, even just using a remembering consciousness, send out or relate to them from this place of these thoughts, these feelings of compassion, wishing that they be free of that negative experience that is arising in their life. So that's just one example of an analytical meditation that a person would use, the purpose of which in 5 years, in 10 years, it becomes easier to relate to all sentient beings from a place of compassion, because all sentient beings are either sentient beings that we care for, sentient beings that are neutral to us, or sentient beings that we have some difficulty with. Um, so if we use representations of those categories, then we can train the mind in simply thinking of them through the lens of compassion, through the way of relating to them as a suffering sentient being who deserves to be happy, deserves to be free of that suffering. And that would be an example of an analytical meditation. Within analytical meditation, there are two subtypes. The first is what we just described, where the goal is to generate the mind into a particular state, the state of experiencing loving kindness or compassion, the state of experiencing generosity, the wish to give to others, the state of restraining the mind from negative actions, ethical restraint. There are other analytical meditations where the goal isn't to generate the mind into a particular state, but the goal is to understand something that is true about the nature of some phenomenon. An example of this would be meditating on impermanence, for example. Um, we all probably know that impermanence is something that the Buddha taught, about the idea that everything that exists on the basis of causes and conditions is something that is changing moment by moment by moment. That's the technical definition of impermanence from a Buddhist perspective. It doesn't actually, oftentimes it's confounded with the idea of things being temporary, things not existing. And it doesn't actually mean that by itself. It simply means that which changes moment by moment by moment. The mind, for example, is an example of a phenomenon that is impermanent because it does change moment by moment by moment. But as we've discussed, the mind is a non-physical energy that is both beginningless and endless from the Buddhist perspective. So the fact that the mind is changing moment by moment by moment doesn't imply or doesn't require that the mind cease at some point. There are many phenomena um, where they are both impermanent and temporary. They will cease at a certain point. They will no longer perform the function that we assign to them, and we call that kind of the ceasing. When this physical body dies and it turns to dust, there's no physical body there to point to and label it as this is Joe's body, this is, Mary's body, because it's become dust. We would say, well, this is the dust that's left. If we knew that had been Mary or Joe, then we would say, well, yeah, this is what's left over of Mary's body. But we wouldn't say, well, there's Mary's body, because it's so different. In the same way, if you have a glass, a drinking glass, and you throw it against the wall, and you have just tiny shards of glass, you wouldn't say, well, there's a drinking glass. You would say, well, before I threw it against the wall, that was a drinking glass, and now it's has a different name. It has a different, so it has ceased being a drinking glass, and now it's a pile of glass shards. Or it was a human body, and now it's a pile of dust. So impermanence, and both of those are examples too of impermanence, right? If the glass wasn't in the nature of being impermanent, then when it hit the wall, it couldn't have become a pile of glass shards. If the human body wasn't in the nature of impermanence, it couldn't have become a pile of dust in a thousand years, or however long it might take. Um, because they those are phenomenon that came together on the basis of causes and conditions. Their nature is impermanence. So it's a topic in Buddhism that a person might want to learn more about, but you're not generating your mind into the nature of impermanence. Your mind is already in the nature of impermanence, and all other phenomenon that exist on the basis of the coming together of causes and conditions are already in the nature of impermanence. You're simply trying to understand that that is true about the nature of your mind, your body, and all other phenomenon that exist due to the coming together of causes and conditions. So that's a subtype of analytical meditation. It's a different purpose for analytical meditations. Sometimes you're trying to absorb your mind into a mental state. Other times you're generating a type of wisdom about what is true from the Buddhist perspective, what is true about something. Um, so we use analytical meditation to do both of those goals. And then you have, as I said, stabilizing meditation. And stabilizing meditation can exist on its own. You can do a session. So what distinguishes a stabilizing meditation from an analytical meditation is that you are not following a chain of logic, argumentation, or reasoning. You are setting your awareness on an object and holding it there without, ideally without distraction. Um, but of course, for us, distraction arises. We notice the distraction. We bring the mind back to the object. Um, but in an ideal world, at some point when we have incredible states of concentration, we can bring that object to mind and just hold it in our mind. That's the ultimate goal from a process standpoint. And so, if you're doing a meditation where you've taken, for example, the breath as the object, you don't have to generate the physical sensation of your breath other than to breathe. There's no logic, there's no argumentation, there's no chain of reasoning. There's simply a felt physical sensation that you are placing with your intention, placing your awareness upon, and then dealing with distraction as it arises. So a stabilizing meditation can exist as its own session of meditation, but also in an analytical meditation, there does also come a point where you have generated the intended object of that meditation. And at that point, you actually stop following the chain of logic or reasoning or argumentation that allowed you to generate that insight. So, for example, with impermanence, you would bring to mind several examples of phenomenon and you would investigate their nature. You would you would understand that the definition of impermanence is that which changes moment by moment by moment. So then you would bring to mind various examples of phenomenon and you would investigate in your mind, is it valid? Is it true that they do in fact change moment by moment by moment? Are they dynamic, unfolding processes that are never truly the same in any two moments of their continuity? So you would use logic, reasoning, argumentation with respect to the objects that you've brought to mind. You could use your physical body, you could use your mind, you could use various physical objects in your room, in nature, other people, etc. And you would interrogate those objects through logic, through reasoning, through argumentation to arrive at the insight that there's nothing that I've ever brought to my mind in meditation that exists, that if it is a phenomenon that owes its existence to the coming together of causes and conditions, there's nothing that meets that definition or that category that doesn't have impermanence as its nature. And that insight then is the purpose of engaging in the process of logic and reasoning and argumentation. Once that insight dawns in your own mind, in your meditation, then you simply absorb your mind in your understanding that you have generated, that all of these phenomenon are impermanent by their nature. The goal is for that wisdom to seep deeply into your mind because, from the Buddhist perspective, we're not very good at relating to things as if they were impermanent, right? It doesn't come very naturally to us. We see things and we hold the view that I saw that yesterday, I'm seeing it today, and it's the same thing. The mug in my cabinet, yesterday's mug and today's mug are the same mug. My body yesterday, my body today, same body. Um, we know there are times when in our lives we're confronted with impermanence. We are confronted with things breaking, things dying. We are confronted with these very obvious signs of impermanence, but we don't understand. We think that that is the result of some specific action. That person died because of a heart attack. That thing broke because it was dropped. Um, we think of them as discrete, events that caused a change. We're not really very good at recognizing that moment by moment by moment, all of these phenomenon are subject to change, are subtly, imperceptibly to our senses engaging in a process of change. And that is what permits them to be influenced by outside forces, by inside forces, and so on. Um, and when we have that understanding, then we're able to relate to things more accurately, more validly, because it simply is true that things exist in that way, that things are subject to impermanence. So there's a value in our spiritual lives of being able to actually relate from a place of that wisdom. And that's the purpose. So I'm just sort of explaining, why would a person do that? Why would they spend time on that day after day, year after year? It's because when that wisdom seeps deeply into the mind, then just like compassion, when compassion seeps deeply into the mind, we're able to relate to others from a place of compassion, and there's many spiritual benefits to that. When the wisdom, understanding impermanence, becomes our baseline state, then that wisdom also has many spiritual benefits. And those are the reasons why we would do that. So it is true that all analytical meditations end in a period of stabilizing meditation where the argumentation, the logic, the reasoning has served its purpose, the object has been generated, and then the goal is to simply rest your mind or steep your mind in the experience of what you've used your meditation to cultivate, to generate. And of course, as we do these meditations over and over and over, our level of insight, our level of wisdom becomes deeper due to the force of familiarity, due to the force of, being able to, we've studied more, we've thought about it more, we have a deeper, our understanding has also been informed by other things that we've meditated on that impact on that. So for many reasons, it is true that our insight changes and deepens over the years. So the very first time that a person meditates on compassion, they do generate an object, but it's very different than a person who's been meditating on compassion for 20 years, 50 years. It's a very subjectively, same general idea, subjectively, very, very different in their mind. So that certainly is true. There's a deepening and a broadening of what is generated. Uh, okay. Any thoughts or questions so far?
I'm good on my end. Thank you.
All right. So that's what I wanted to address on the types of meditation. So now we'll begin to talk about what obstacles we can expect. All right, no problem. So, what are the obstacles when we begin to meditate, when we wish to have a practice, a meditation practice? What are the obstacles that we can expect to arise? And so, of course, when these arise, we shouldn't beat ourselves up or think that there's something wrong with us. The Buddha taught on these because they have been his own direct experience, and before he perfected the process, and he observed it in everyone that he was teaching as well. And all of the teachers that came after him have had the exact same experiences. So there are five classical examples of these obstacles. Um, so the first, we'll list them and then we'll go back and we'll give more detail. So the first is called laziness. The second is called forgetting the object of meditation. The third is a combination of two, which are mental excitement or mental agitation, and then mental dullness or mental laxity. They're two ends of the same spectrum. The fourth is what's called non application. And then the fifth is called over application. So those are just the titles of the five. So we'll go back to laziness, which is the first of these five classical examples. So laziness is what we struggle with in terms of getting started in our practice and then also even sustaining our practice. When we have no habit of meditation and we wish to develop a habit of meditation, and we have this um, kind of inertia that is kind of preventing that momentum, that's laziness from the Buddhist perspective. It's something that we will struggle with for a long time, because even when we get some momentum, there are going to be days where we're just like, well, maybe tomorrow, maybe, things are busy. Um, so what's important to understand in general about the Buddhist understanding of the idea of laziness is that mean it doesn't necessarily mean that we're attracted to harmful things or kind of, um, you know, m totally meaningless things from a general perspective. It means that we have, so it doesn't mean that like we are scrolling Instagram or sleeping or that we're playing video games. Those are examples. Those can be forms of laziness, um, but it doesn't imply that necessarily, because laziness from the Buddhist perspective is simply not being deeply attracted to what is spiritually really helpful, spiritually really beneficial. And that can look like being absorbed in our careers, in our hobbies, in just being really busy with filling our days with a lot of activities that are not are part of our spiritual path. Not setting aside time to study and to meditate. um, so we might say, oh well, I've got this really important job, or I've got all of these responsibilities and so on. From the Buddhist perspective, what we're not doing is valuing how important our spiritual lives are, and we're not carving out time. No one's saying that you don't have to, that you can't have a career and you can't do things. But if something is valuable, if something is something that you really cherish, then in your day you'll look at your schedule and you'll make time. You'll carve out time to be able to fit it in as well. So when we make excuses by saying, well, I've got so many meetings, and what that means is we haven't really looked at our priorities and we haven't given our spiritual lives the importance that it really deserves, that we really think that, if it is something valuable, if it is something that we really want to make progress in, we just have to do that work. We've got to look at our lives and figure out where it's going to go and what we're going to reduce in order to make that happen. Um, so it's a lack of discipline as it relates to including our spiritual lives as part of what we're doing. But it doesn't have the same definition that, because we consider people who just spend, all day in the office as, go-getters and so on. And from the Buddhist perspective, there isn't, you're really not making time to do the things that are the most important, because that wealth, that status, and so on, there's some benefit to it, but all of that benefit is going to fall away at death. But from the Buddhist perspective, the training in your mind that you're able to engage in over the course of your life, the degree to which you become familiar with generosity and patience and so on, those impulses, those tendencies, those habits, they remain in the mind even beyond death. So they're much more useful, much more valuable than the other things that we might do. Um, but again, it's just about creating a new habit, creating a new familiarity, and really intentionally making time for it. And of course, that we're going to have really tough days, really busy days. Um, but how do we, on those days, did we have lunch? Did we brush our teeth? Did we walk the dog? Did we do the dishes? We did those things, right? Even on those tough days, we found ways of not living in filth, feeding ourselves, looking after the basic needs of the sentient beings in our home. So we can also find time, if it's incredibly important to us, to do our 20-minute, meditation is the goal. So the second then is forgetting the object, and this happens in a session of meditation, whereas laziness is preventing those sessions from being a habit. Forgetting the object is occurring in a given session. And this is all of these, as I said, totally normal, totally reasonable, happens to everyone. Forgetting the object is just simply getting distracted. It's just, if it's a breathing meditation, we know that the object is the present moment physical sensation of the air as it moves into and then back out of our body, particularly attending to that sensation at the opening of the nostrils, generally speaking. Or if you choose, you could use the rising and falling of the abdomen. Um, but that is the object. And so anything that arises in the mind that isn't that present moment physical sensation is not the object. When those things are dawning in the mind, you have forgotten the object. You have moved into distraction. And that's forgetting the object. That's this second obstacle, which again, is going to, it always will be happening for many, many years. You will have moments of forgetting the object. The goal is not to get discouraged, not to feel like it means that you are particularly bad at this, but to just notice that the mind has moved into distraction, to let go of attending to that distraction, and then to regain your focus on whatever your intended object was, whatever you told yourself was the purpose of that specific session of meditation. So the third then is this pair, the third obstacle, or this pair of obstacles: mental excitation and mental dullness. So mental excitation is a very bright mind. It is a mind that is jumping from the intended object to a variety of unintended objects, distractions. So this is a racing mind, a mind that just, is thinking about what I'm going to do for dinner. What am I going to do when I talk to this person? I need to finish this report. My body hurts. How many more minutes do I have to sit here? It's a very racing, bright, energetic mind that is moving off of the intended object. Again, that is a incredibly common issue that arises when we try to meditate, because we haven't really practiced holding the mind on one intended object. That's not a normal thing. That, I mean, of course, we all have some experience in trying to just read a book, or get some report done, or get some project done, and we know that it's not helpful when the mind goes, so we do have some experience in bringing the mind back and back and back. But sustained focused attention is not something that we do a lot of. So the scattering of the mind will be with us for many decades, maybe with us our whole lives. Um, Dullness is the opposite end of that spectrum. Mental laxity, mental dullness is on the other side of this energetic spectrum. This is when the mind is heavy, is dark, is tending toward sleepiness, drowsiness, could even be nodding off, falling asleep in your meditation. It's a very low energy, very dull, very dark mind. And again, very, very common, can happen if we don't get enough sleep that day, if we're maybe meditating at the wrong time for us, um, if we've just had a very demanding day, and we're trying to still get that session of meditation in, then these are times when dullness or laxity are going to arise in the mind. Okay, so when excitation and dullness arise in the mind, just like with forgetting the object, we need to cultivate a sense of vigilance. And this is where we've been talking about introspective awareness, kind of using a corner of our mind to observe how well our session of meditation is going. Um, Noticing that we have, in fact, slipped off of the intended object, either into ping-ponging on a variety of other objects, or that we've just kind of slipped into dullness, into torpor, um, drowsiness, sleepiness. Because if we don't know what's happening, we can't actually apply a more specific antidote. There are specific strategies that we would apply if dullness is arising, and there are specific strategies that we would apply if excitation is arising, and they wouldn't be appropriate if the reverse was happening. Because we want to either loosen or tighten the intensity of our concentration. Um, if excitation is arising, then there's too much energy in the system of our mind. and we need to bring that energy down. We need to kind of rein in the mind. If dullness is what is happening, if that's the problem, then there's not enough energy in our system. And we need to inject more energy into that system to raise the level of our mind up to be able to have calm, focused attention on the intended object. Um, so, one thing, specific ideas that we can work with. Um, if the mind is wandering, distracted, we can pause the meditation. If, for example, this doesn't work if it is a breathing meditation, but if it's an analytical meditation, we could pause for a couple of minutes and shift into a breathing meditation, right? Because we that is a stabilizing meditation. And with a stabilizing meditation, there's no intentional discursiveness in the mind. The mind knows what its object is, and the mind is simply going to absorb into that object. There's no intentional discursiveness. And that can be helpful for calming over an overly discursive mind, a mind that is flying here, flying there. So we can do 2 or 3 minutes of emphasizing concentration in that way to lower the mind's energy. There's another couple visualization techniques um, that we could do. Um, one is if a person is interested in Buddhism and maybe they're moving in a particularly Buddhist direction, you could imagine the historical Buddha or a different enlightened being above the crown of your head. And you could imagine that visualization is quite small and also quite dense, has a weight to it. You kind of relate to it as if that was true about it. We do visualize, it's a little tricky because when you visualize enlightened, and of course you may not want to, it's sort of assuming that a person would want to. If you do, then it is true that you are often encouraged, or the teachings encourage visualizing enlightened beings to be luminous, to be translucent, to be luminous, to be radiant. So it isn't that you imagine like an iron or a steel, little Buddha statue. It is luminous, it is radiant, but at the same time, just in your mind, you imagine it as if it had weight to it, as if it had kind of a heaviness or a mass to it. Um, that way of thinking about it can also tame excitation in the mind. Um, and, if you were using meditation in a different religious system, then certainly, as a just simply as a technique, then of course you could use a figure from a different religious system to accomplish the same purpose. Another visualization technique is to imagine inside the body, at the level of the navel, inside the middle of the body, is a small, like mustard seed or sesame seed or grain of rice um, that is energetic. It isn't a grain of rice, but it's about that size. And you imagine that the top half is white and the bottom half is red. And this is for excitation. So you would just hold your attention on that image for a couple of minutes. What that would do is, from a Buddhist perspective, that what that would do is cause your mind to attend to the lower chakras of the body, which would lower your energy, would kind of ground your energy. Um, that's an option. Another option, another suggestion is to, if you find again that your mind is scattered, incredibly flighty, you could do a couple of minutes of meditation on a serious, sobering topic, because that flightiness, kind of indulging in that flightiness, is happening because, maybe there's a lack of the importance of what you're doing. You're kind of going off into these flights of fancy because you're not clearly understanding in that moment how important what you're doing is. So, if, for example, you spent a couple of minutes recollecting that, you yourself are subject to death, um, and when that happens, when the moment of your death arrives, all of your opportunities in this life to make spiritual progress are gone, right? That's kind of a wake-up call. That's a very sobering thought. And that can kind of help you be like, okay, I, I need to kind of buckle down here. All of these, I can't indulge. I don't have time to think about all of these silly, kind of meaningless, unimportant topics because things, time is running out. That can help you to kind of give yourself a little bit of a kick in the pants to, to really attend to what you're doing. Um, yeah, so that can also kind of ground your mind. Let me pause again. We'll address mental dullness or laxity next, but I'll just pause in case I said something that sparked a question or a thought or an objection or a concern, a disagreement. Nope. All right. So then dullness or laxity. Again, very often we will be experiencing the mind tending toward dullness, tending toward sleepiness. Um, so one thing that we can do that's practical is to think about, in the very first class, we talked about the posture of, maintaining an upright spine and so on, creating a stable posture, not slouching, not leaning. So, if our physical posture has begun to become too relaxed, if there is a hunched position that we've begun to adopt, that will certainly aid in dullness and sleepiness arising. So, if we can correct our physical posture, we can just take note of our physical. And of course, that's an important reason why we try to check in with our physical posture in every session. But if we can really take a look at our posture and then make an adjustment, that can, to straighten the spine, elongate the body, that can really help. Um, so there's a question. I never knew. Mhm. Struggling with consistency, right, is the question. Yeah, so there's, I think there's three things that are really that come to my mind as being um, useful and important in terms of being consistent. Of course, being patient, with all of these, we do have to recognize that it's a new habit and it's going to take time. And so we shouldn't if we beat ourselves up about it, then that's not productive. Um, so we need to, be kind to ourselves as we're trying to develop a new habit. I think the most important thing is to really be very clear about why, what is the goal. Um, What is our purpose? Why do we want to do it? Um, and if we can just if if at the beginning of every day, for example, even before we get out of bed, just as soon as we open our eyes, if we can check in with our purpose. What is the purpose of my life? What is the purpose of my spiritual life? What is important to me? What are my priorities? That and that can color our whole day. And then, we can check in with that multiple times a day. We can find a routine for when am I going to pause? And, and people do this kind of in different ways. They come up with their own way of reminding themselves. Sometimes people will do it every time they get out of, like before they get out of their car. That's you've parked and now you're gonna, so you just take 30 seconds to remind yourself of, what your priorities are, what's important to you. Sometimes people will do it like after breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So three times, so morning, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then maybe as you're going to sleep, 5 times. That 5 times a day is amazing to like remind yourself of your own spiritual, you know, goals and aspirations and interests. Because if we're not real clear about why, then that makes it real hard to get started. And then when we are approaching a session of meditation, we want to keep it very short. We want to probably do minutes, or 6, 7 minutes. Um, and and no more than it should, when we end the session of meditation, we should still feel kind of fresh. We should still feel like we could do a little bit more. We shouldn't feel, if we're starting to feel like this is interminable, um, I'm going on, then for our next session, we should do shorter. We shouldn't try to do that long. And this will change day by day depending on, how what's going on in our lives and how stressed out we are and so on. I find what is really reinforcing is that luckily, I think what's really good news about this is that it does feel really good to do. To spend 5 minutes at the beginning of our day, even just doing a breathing meditation or something. And so that, because it feels really good, it's reinforcing. We begin to notice days that we didn't do it. And um, and then from a practical standpoint, of course, we need to really think about, what have I talked to the people in my household about this being important to me? Have I thought about how my days normally go? And have I blocked out time, to really do this? Or am I just kind of hoping that it's going to magically work out? Because that's probably true, right? Because if we live with other people, or different pressures and so on, those are going to take over. If we've not really thought about the rhythm of our day, or we blocked out the time and explained to other people, this is my time and this is important. So please help me, support me in this decision, support me in having this time, um, and really give it the space that it needs. And then I think going along with being patient is not, in addition to not doing too many minutes, we should also not think that the habit should be built very quickly, that immediately it makes sense or it's reasonable for me to think I'll just do this every single day. Um, Going along with this practical strategy of what is my day like, what are the pressures of my life and other people and so on, we should develop a pretty long-term strategy for ending up with a good habit, which could look like next week just meditating once, on a day when there's not, on a Saturday or some when there's really not much happening. And, we say, okay, next Saturday, I'm pretty sure this is what my day is going to look like when Saturday is 3 days away. Pretty sure this is what my Saturday. So at 9 o'clock in the morning or whatever, this is what I'm going to do. And then probably you'll do it, because you picked a good day, you picked a good time, and so on. Um, and then the next week, you just do two. You pick, 2 days. Um, or maybe the next week, you don't. You just do that Saturday again. That you pick 2 days. And then, you know, maybe you do 1 day a week for 2 or 3 weeks, 2 days a week for 2 weeks, 3 days a week for 2 or 3 weeks. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that feels like a very slow process. But in not too many months, you could very well be gotten yourself to a point where it's pretty much every day. And then you can start thinking about starting over, maybe with twice a day, and how many days a week can I get to twice a day? And kind of think of it, almost like in a gamified kind of way, holding it lightly, not thinking of it. As I said, the good news is that it feels really pleasant when we do it, and that really is reinforcing. But if we think about it like you say, you use the phrase, I know I need to. Um, if we, and that kind of shoulding is, can be self-defeating. If you can think about, oh, I get to, I'm able to. This is something that can be part of my life. I can get the benefits of doing this. I have the time and the ability to get these incredible benefits. Framing of it can, when and you think about it more joyfully, then that's also going to be reinforcing. Feels like a chore, or it feels like something that you should do, you must do, need to do. That's gonna, that way of thinking about it is gonna actually give rise to aversion in your own mind, which will then take you away from it, as will pushing yourself, either in sessions that are too long or having an unrealistic expectation of how many sessions, you're able to do. Um, so really just trying to, so connecting it to your spiritual purpose, thinking about it in a joyful way, being really practical um, about how do I emphasize this? How do I fit this in to my life? Not allowing, in the same way that you wouldn't allow someone or life to like prevent you from eating, you're gonna figure that out. You just think, well, this is how I'm gonna figure it out. This is where I'm gonna carve out the time. Um, and really recruiting a support system as much as you can, and it could be accountability, an accountability partner can be helpful too. um, a- and again, I don't mean that in a negative way, but like if somebody else in your life wants to go on this journey with you in maybe in their own way, but you could talk about like, oh, how did it go? This is how it went for me. Or you tell them, Elaine was talking about, she did a workshop last week. She's a resident teacher right now. And her workshop was on doing a retreat. She said one of the best ways of a short, like a weekend retreat. She said one of the best ways is to tell someone, I'm going to do a weekend retreat, right? Because then that's sort of like that you're planting the seed you're kind of speaking it into existence, and so on. So if you've got somebody in your life that's like also, and friends, even at the center, we've got a WhatsApp group, social, people post there. You could make friends or make friends in you whatever wherever you are, at a local sangha, things like that, um, and just talk about it with them, and really kind of be in it together and say, oh, I'm Saturday is my day. What's your day? How did it go? This is how it went for me, and so on. Feeling supported in that way is really helpful. Um, and then in terms of the last thing I'll say, maybe sometimes I just think of um, probably the last thing that I would say is that you shouldn't, well, I don't want to use the word should or shouldn't, but I think it's helpful to experiment with different objects. And in the beginning, to do to prioritize the kind of objects that are that you particularly gravitate toward. So, I mean, eventually, it is true if a person really wants to move in a very Buddhist direction, and they really want to make that their life, then it does become true that not every object of meditation is necessarily something. I mean, of course, calm, focused attention is something that feels good, cultivating that, but there are certain topics that that are heavier than other topics, right? And in the moment, confronting certain things isn't always something that brings in immediately. It brings long-term benefits, but in the moment, it can feel kind of heavy. Um, so it's very good to just do what you enjoy doing, when you're trying to develop the habit, and not kind of force any particular, if you don't gravitate toward it, if it's not something that you enjoy, then don't do it. um, do just focus on the kinds of things that you are particularly gravitating toward, that you really enjoy doing. That will, the kinds, if it's loving kindness, if it's compassion, if that really, makes your mind happy, um, then really just kind of focus on that.
Can I ask a question on
All right.
the, you
Yes.
mentioned,
Mhm.
you mentioned, you mentioned duration and, well, and I know just for if it's beneficial to anybody, for me, it really helps just to, I try to meditate in the morning. I know in the evenings, my mind is kind of, yeah, usually just tired, preoccupied with, what happened during the day. But my question, I guess, like when I sit in the morning, and whether I sit for 5 minutes or 20 minutes, I think I go through various different obstacles in that time frame. But is there really a benefit to keeping it to that shorter time? Because I kind of, I don't mind sitting for 20 minutes. And if I actually have the time, sometimes I'll sit for 30 minutes. And of course, it's not like, my mind is all over, I might in 30 minutes get 5 good minutes of focus or, so just say, does that make sense? Is the question? Just,
Mhm. Well, I mean, I guess, people's practice is very personal, and people, there isn't one right way or wrong way. Um, I would say that if one thing that you could check in with, or that we could check in with, is that at the end of however long it is the mind still happy? Does it still feel fresh? Because there is an exertion, right? There is holding the mind in this way. It does require mental effort. So at the end, do you feel, still fresh and that like, well, if I could do, I could do a few more minutes, or is it were you like checking the time at the end and like kind of becoming more restless? Those might be signs, if there's restlessness, if there's agitation that's creeping in toward the end, and you're really kind of fighting the urge to do something else, that could be a sign that it might be a little bit too long. The other thing that would be in the teachings would be that if I mean, it is the goal that from a process standpoint, we want to cultivate the ability to hold the intended object in the mind without distraction. And as beginner, meditators, as you know, distraction is constantly arising. So, and dealing with that requires mental reserves, mental energy, that we're kind of, and that we're practicing, that we're cultivating this habit. So it it can be more productive. You can actually make progress more rapidly if you're not overly taxing that system of bringing the mind back, holding the mind to the object. And so, one thing you could experiment with, if you have 20 minutes and you're really happy with that, um, and of course, this is something over time that does expand. I mean, a person who's only meditated for, if it's their first month, that's very different than if it's their second year, if it's their fifth, it's very different. These are things that are, it isn't true that all people forever should only ever do 10 minutes, or you start there, right? Um, but one thing that you could try or you could experiment with is if 20 minutes kind of feels like a generally good idea, you could do, 9 minutes. And then on the 10th minute, you don't get up, you don't walk around, you don't go do something else. You just simply open your eyes and maybe you just look around, you adjust your posture. you kind of relax your mental effort a little bit. You maybe just look out the window. You just sort of you defocus, you de-emphasize, you let the mind wander a little bit for about a minute, and then you do another session right on the same cushion, without any major shift. You give yourself just a little bit of a pause, a little bit of a loosening of your concentration, um, and see if by experimenting with that, see if maybe those two sessions feel a little bit more productive, um, than one longer session. Because broadly speaking, the advice is many short sessions or multiple short sessions can lead to faster progress than a smaller number of longer sessions. Um, but it is something that people have to judge for themselves. It's not, sessions do lengthen over time. It's also true. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, so we have about 10 more minutes, and so we'll finish up talking about what to do when mental dullness or mental laxity arises. We talked about what to do when excitation arises. When in our sessions, when we are tending toward drowsiness, sleepiness, dullness, heaviness, then there are specific things we can do. Um, Again, we started to talk about the posture, um, correcting our posture, straightening the back. That's one thing. Um, the other thing we can do that's practical is to raise the amount of light. It could be that the room is too dark, where our eyes are too tightly closed. If we are a bit sleepy, then of course there's a tendency that we've totally shut our eyes. And if we do a half closed eye, that will, or we just turn on more lights. Having more light in our in coming into the eyes will be helpful. The other thing we can do, we can go back to that same visualization technique of that small mustard seed in the body, visualizing this energetic dot in the body. Again, but instead of holding your concentration on this energetic dot, you would bring it up through the body and you would kind of shoot it up through the top of the back of the head. And you would do this maybe 10 times, and that would, this is the opposite of holding your concentration at the level of the navel on this dot by bringing it up through the body and shooting it kind of in your imagination through the top of the back of the head. This raises your energy level. This associates your mind with the upper chakras rather than the lower chakras, and that increases spaciousness in the mind and so on. Again, another opposite is to do a short reflection, not on a sobering topic like mortality as we did for excitation, but on a joyful, uplifting topic. For example, thinking about how amazing it is that you have a body and mind that's able to meditate, that you live in relative, safety and comfort, and you have enough food to eat. You're not struggling, with whether or not, where your next meal is going to come from. There's no crushing poverty. There's no, war that at least is in our country at the moment. So you have all of these incredible inner and outer conditions that are supporting your spiritual path, and how incredible that is, how amazing your life is. That can raise your energy level. Um, those are all very practical things that you can do if you're tending toward drowsiness, heaviness, dullness in your in your meditation session. Um, And another thing too, you might do some light exercise. If you think that you might tend toward drowsiness in your session, then before you start, maybe energize the body and mind with some yoga, some stretching, walk around the block, things like that. Nothing too intense, but to just slightly raise your heart rate can be helpful before you go into that session if you're feeling a little bit, drowsy. Um, and also thinking about the time of day, like Anthony was saying, it, it is true that they often recommend meditating in the morning. Um, Hopefully you wake up refreshed. Hopefully that's a good, because at the end of the day, we've kind of been subjected to stress and pressure, and that can be a challenging time to try to meditate after all of that, after traffic and so on. First thing in the morning, it doesn't work for everybody. Some people are just not morning people. It's not universally useful advice, but it's something to experiment with. It's something to give a shot, to and see how it goes. Because the mind is, ideally, the mind is refreshed. The mind is also kind of light. The mind is a bit subdued, naturally subdued um, during that time, during that first, hour of wakefulness. So, and that can also be, if that works for you, that can also be a good way of having a routine, right? You wake up, you go into the bathroom, and then you just meditate, right? It's just a natural, nothing has really intruded on your life at that point. It's all just kind of the first hour of being conscious. It can be a helpful way to make it work in your life. All right. So we'll leave it there for today. We've got some more obstacles to talk about when we start in our final class next week. That's where we'll pick up again. Are there any final thoughts or questions? Nope. All right. So we will pick things up again next week with our final class. And again, these classes are recorded on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to check out the previous classes, you can go to tnlsf.org, go to the top, go to the left banner where it talks about the YouTube channel. Click on that and find the recordings there. But otherwise, I hope to see everyone next week.